History in a nutshell. The 1950s was simultaneously a prosperous and strenuous time for America. The United States was in the midst of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. While the Cold War was not an actual physical war, where Americans and Soviets met each other in open combat, it was more of a battle for supremacy, competing for superior political, economic, and military influence in the world. Both sides were trying to outdo one another in almost every way, including scientific advancements, technological breakthroughs, and setting records. This is illustrated with scientists and test pilots on both sides working together to build craft which can go higher, farther, and faster than ever before. One of the greatest forefathers of test flying is former United States Air Force pilot Charles E. Chuck Yeager. Yeager is most widely known for breaking the sound barrier in the rocket-powered plane, the X-1, in October 1947. With pilots like Yeager, the United States arguably dominated the skies in the 1950s. But that would all change one October evening in 1957. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union completely caught the United States off guard by broaching the new frontier, outer space. A 184-pound aluminum satellite named Sputnik was launched into a low Earth orbit where it remained in operation for around 3 weeks. It could be seen with the naked eye, and its signal could be picked up on any ordinary radio. The US was on high alert as a result. Not only did the Russians beat the US by making it to space first, but there were growing fears that the Soviets could put something much more deadly than a metal sphere into orbit. The Eisenhower administration had to act and consulted with engineers and scientists, one of whom was Dr. Wernher von Braun, who would later go on to design the Saturn series of rockets, which carried astronauts to the moon. After a failed attempt with Vanguard 1, the United States succeeded with Explorer 1 in January 1958. These are the beginnings of what would become known as the space race. America's space agency at the time was the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA. President Dwight Eisenhower decided that the agency should be civilian-controlled instead of military. The NACA became the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, on October 1st, 1958. The next big leap in this race would be to put a man into space, and the United States considered several methods for doing just that. The United States Air Force had its own program called Man in Space Soonest, which relied more on rocket-powered aircraft, such as the X-15. However, with the formation of NASA's Project Mercury, the Man in Space Soonest program was deemed redundant and ultimately scrapped. Same goal in mind, but different approaches. NASA's Project Mercury would put a man into space by using booster rockets. These rockets, originally designed to carry nuclear warheads, were modified to carry spacecraft instead. This then begs the question: who was the United States going to get to ride these rockets? Some consider the concept of strapping a man on top of a rocket to be not only dangerous, but crazy. So crazy that even stuntmen and circus performers were once considered for the job of astronaut. But President Eisenhower remained firm on who he believed should take on this task: test pilots. Over 100 men tried out for Project Mercury, but few were selected. The people selected would be introduced as the Mercury 7 in April of 1959. These 7 individuals were considered the greatest pilots in America, though they would have their work cut out for them, since the next few years were devoted to training, testing, and getting ready for their trips to space. The first few missions would be suborbital flights, then followed by orbital ones. But the first being to ride in Mercury would not be one of the 7. Instead, it was decided that a final test was needed before sending a human into space. A chimpanzee named Ham would be the first to go up in January of 1961. The Mercury 7 were thrilled about that, especially Alan Shepard, who was selected to be the first man to go up. All the monkey jokes aside, the test flight was a success, but ended up delaying the flight schedule. This would cost the United States, as the Soviets struck again by sending cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into space in April of 1961. The Soviets killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only were they the first into space, but orbited the Earth as well. This would lead to a series of the Russians getting ahead and America's playing catch-up. America would get its next step in the space race in May of 1961 with Alan Shepard on board Freedom 7.
All right, liftoff and the clock has started.
While Gagarin's mission lasted about an hour and a half, Shepard's flight was merely a 15-minute suborbital flight. Moved by the success of its first manned space mission, then-President John F. Kennedy declared to Congress that America would beat the Russians to the moon and get there by the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
After a second suborbital flight with Gus Grissom in Liberty Bell 7, it was decided to replace the old Redstone booster with the more powerful Atlas rocket, because the Redstone simply was not powerful enough to push a spacecraft into orbit. America would finally put a man into orbit the following year.
Eagle, loud and clear. Roger, we're programming and roll okay. Godspeed, John Glenn.
In February 1962, John Glenn successfully orbited the Earth in Friendship 7.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
Even though his mission was cut short due to a faulty sensor switch, John Glenn became an instant American icon. The three following flights were all successful, and Mercury ended with Leroy Gordo Cooper in 1963, paving the way for Phase 2 of America's race to the moon, Project Gemini.